everyone, welcome to Backseat Designers, the podcast where three friends sit down and bitch about adventure games and apparently also get their heads cracked open when they're out drinking, because that's what happened to me last night. But we're not going to dwell on that. The task of hosting this podcast has now befallen onto me because of my esteemed co-host. Of the three of us, I am by far the most gory right now.
That's correct.
6 stitches and all that.
Oh, yeah.
So, I am, of course, Toles Plymouth, the Space Quest historian, and I am joined by two of my dear, lovely friends. Say hi, Fred.
Hello.
And say hi, Dr. Millwood.
Hello.
See, I remembered your title now. I titulated you correctly.
You did.
If you ever hear that voice coming from behind you saying hello in that tone of voice, it's time to run, kids.
It's time to call the doctor. So, doctor, what's the diagnosis for today?
Well, I think we're going to be talking about a lot of violence and gore and horrid adult themes, mature themes in adventure games.
Very ethical.
Yes, very ethical. Excellent diagnosis. Do you concur, Fred?
Yes, I concur. That's exactly what we're going to talk about, and it's going to be skull-crackingly fun.
Yes. I seem to be an expert on that at the moment. So let's just dive right into it. Why are we talking about gore and violence in adventure games?
Well, I think adventure games, especially with the sort of some of the LucasArts and Sierra games from earlier on, they tended to be more in the kind of the fairy tale genre, or there seems to be this idea for quite a long time that computer games were the kind of things that were played by kids.
Yes.
But then at the same time, there were also these games that had some pretty dark adult themes, and this was sort of coinciding with the video nasty in the 1980s and this idea that video games being violent were somehow going to turn all of our kids into rampaging psychopaths, which of course happened.
Yeah.
Yes,
that's
of course,
exactly
because
what happened.
Dungeons and Dragons made them go down into the sewer and stab each other with sharp kitchen utensils, and video games, of course, made us all steal cars and run over prostitutes.
Yeah, and shoot lots of people at American high schools. That doesn't have to do with anything that, that doesn't have anything to do with the fact that the guns are readily accessible over the counter in most major stores. It's the video games.
All right,
I
we
played
got political.
so much Mario Kart one summer that I failed my driving test because I was just chucking bananas out the back of the car.
Oh, stop making me laugh.
Yeah, we have a challenge on tonight's show, which is kind of in the same vein, get it, as the subject, which is that we, under no circumstances, can make Trolls laugh because then his stitches will open. So that's exactly what we're going to try to make him do.
Exactly. I have 6 stitches in my upper lip, and every time I open my mouth slightly wide, it just goes pop, bing, zoom, and then viscous things fall out of me.
Yeah, at one point you're going to have a 7th one.
So we're going to keep this very, very non-funny. Actually, getting back to the topic, one of the things that I find very interesting about this topic is that we've all heard the adage that comedy writing is hard. It's really hard to be funny, and of course that's true. It's true of all mediums, especially in computer games. Being funny, I mean, just look at the difference between The Secret of Monkey Island, an incredibly funny game, and Deponia, an incredibly racist, awful game. But I would also like to flip that on the head and say that horror writing is also damn hard, and horror, at least in the movies, has been often maligned. I don't recall any horror movie winning an Oscar or anything like that, except for maybe Silence of the Lambs.
Well, The Exorcist and, the bona fide classics that are kind of more psychological. I can't remember any ultra-violent horror movie winning
Fred,
an Oscar.
Who is this Mr. Fidey, and why is his first name Bonnie?
His first name is not Bonnie, it's Boner. Boner Fidey.
Boner Fidey. But yeah, you're absolutely right. And this is no less true of computer games that try to have horror elements, and especially adventure games. I mean, presenting a horrific theme in an adventure game style where you don't have, a lot of horror movies rely on shock value and jump scares and such, and it's very hard to get away with that in a computer game.
I do kind of want to distinguish gore and violence from horrific situations, because that's something I thought of when Gareth was talking about the fact that many of the early adventure games that we worship are a kind of kiddie material. Sierra wouldn't dive completely into trying to create an adult interactive storytelling experience before they did the first Gabriel Knight. That was like their first foray into that genre. And to me, there is certainly a difference between horror and having a violent situation. And we must also remember that for many of us, and we got a bit into that when we talked about walking simulators, many of us consider the death experience in an adventure game frustrating and eliminating that urgency that you can die or that your character can be injured kind of makes it difficult to implement violence in a wide scale, I think.
Well, I just wanted to make the point that what I was getting at was that to substitute real horror, or quote unquote real horror, real horrific situations, the easy way out, the cop out, as it were, is to just include a lot of violence and gore and perhaps a pair of boobies or not. And sometimes it's warranted. I mean, for instance, like in Gabriel Knight, there's a couple of very gory scenes in Gabriel Knight, but it's not like all over the place. No. Not like the game that I'm going to bring up in a minute, Harvester, for instance. Or just some of the other, early to mid 90s gory games where, Mortal Kombat and such, where it was really the main selling point. You can rip off people's limbs. So to put this into sort of an anthropological context, Dr. Gareth Millwood, why do you think we are so, just on a whole, why do you think we're so fascinated by violence and gore in movies and computer games and other forms of media?
I don't know. I mean, I think to a certain extent you want that kind of emotional response, but I completely agree with you. And I think by drawing that parallel between horror and comedy, that was a really good way of putting it, because you do get what you want. I think from a game that has adult themes, to do it properly, it needs to be contextual within the universe that you've built. It's meant to be there to shock to a certain extent, but it's also meant to be there so that you can explore some of the darker sides of being human. And in much the same way, just throwing blood or violence in there for the shock value is completely and utterly redundant. It would be the same if it was a comedy game and they were just throwing farts in there just because they've got no way of actually building any kind of suspense or making you really feel anything. And
it kind of desensitizes you to it, doesn't it? I mean, the Gabriel Knight scenes are effective because they are so rare. Certainly, there's a great Gabriel Knight 2 scene where you discover Von Zell, the titular beast of the game, or rather, he has a beast within because he's a werewolf.
Everyone's a fucking werewolf in that game.
And yeah, true. And everyone's a fucking werewolf in that game.
Just pop the stitch.
There we go. And there's this lovely little cutscene where you discover him in his cave feasting on rotten human remains. And it's a great little moment. And I think it's probably the first real gory moment in that game. And the way it's executed, even though it's a relatively primitive 1990s FMV game, is it's very well done.
Oh yeah, but even the first game, the violence and gore doesn't really show up until you reach the end game. If you piss off Dr. John, he will crush your fucking skull.
That is true. That's the bad alternate ending. But yeah, he's really smashing Grace up. It's kind of similar to what you've just been through.
Yeah, except my assailant was merely a wooden potted plant box or something. But anyway, getting back into the whole reason why, if we're talking like horror material, like good old-fashioned horror, we're talking, and you said it yourself, mature themes. We're talking about a mature audience, and usually blood and gore and bouncing tits and all that appeals to a slightly younger demographic, let's just say, of a slightly more immature kind. And I will concede that I am that slightly immature because I dearly love tits and blood, except when it's my own pouring out of my face.
Tits and blood.
Tits pouring out your face.
Oh yeah.
That's a new kind of injury. Is it contagious? Because then I might come round to your place.
But the thing I wanted to get to is that you've also got examples of both in games and movies, you've got examples of horror that uses gore and blood and such in very effective ways. I'm thinking of like Cronenberg movies from the late 80s, like Videodrome and Scan,
of course.
What's it? Oh yeah, The Thing. Oh dear God, it's a gore fest, but it's also very, very good. And I think that's what they were going for in games like Phantasmagoria, for instance, which completely and utterly failed, of course, because no one in their right mind would say that Phantasmagoria was a compelling piece of interactive storytelling.
Well, Ken Williams probably did.
Well, he kind of had to.
Yeah, he kind of had to because his wife designed it. Yes, dear, it's great. Carry on.
Actually, the legend goes that she didn't actually design it. Andy Hoyles did.
You're shattering all illusions here.
But anyway, so let's get into the spirit of things. Let's get into Fred. We've all picked out a game that we wanted to discuss, and I think we should just go around in a sort of random order. And I think I'll just pass the hat to Fred.
Oh, okay, thank you. Well, I thought a little bit about which game I was going to talk about, and I don't play a lot of games with mature themes. Ironically, not because I try to avoid them, but just because I just haven't been in those dark corners, not in the adventure game genre certainly, but one game that I did play a couple of years ago is called Trilby's Notes, and it's done by Ben Croshaw, who calls himself Yahtzee.
Yahtzee!
And he did, Yahtzee. And he did this series called the Chizo Mythos, I think it's pronounced.
CHZO, which it just sounds like someone sneezing.
The Mythos. And Trilby's Notes was the third game. The first was 5 Days a Stranger, I think, and the second was 7 Days, something I can't remember. And those were kind of gory, but Trilby's Notes really took it to new levels in that you have this sort of Silent Hill-like situations and Frambo-like situation for that matter, where you will at various points be transported into this alternate realm, which is full of rotten carcasses and blood and shit. No tits as far as I know, but
blood and shit.
Yeah, plenty of gory stuff. Thing is, though, that compared to some of the games that you're going to tackle, Trilby's Notes is very low res. It only uses standard VGA resolution. So, in my mind, that actually helps make it more effective because the gore is all in there and there's a lot of red in this game, but it's kind of suggested. It's kind of blurred out by the VGA resolution. You don't see everything, but you just go, my God, there is so much blood in here. And I think that's more powerful. Your mind kind of fills in the blank spaces. How would this look if I was standing directly in front of it? It's kind of filtered, and I love that because it makes for a more psychologically engaging experience, I think.
I've played a bit of this, of Trilby's Notes. I never got very far into it. It's a text adventure, and you're running around this old hotel.
It's not really text adventure. It uses a parser.
Yeah, sorry, it uses a parser. Sorry, I'm getting my shit mixed up here. But I played just like 10 or 15 minutes of it, and I was just walking around this abandoned hotel. People are sort of lying around dead, but it's not that gory. But then all of a sudden, I was just walking down the stairwell, and boom. I got transported into, like you say, this alternate sort of reality. You're still in the hallway, but all of a sudden, all the decks are covered with blood. All the da-da-da-da-da-da. And I was just, what the fuck is happening? Does this happen on a timer or at random, or is it just is it scripted?
Well, if I remember correctly, some of them are scripted. You can trigger some of them to advance the story by looking at various items, and you will also receive some flashbacks that flesh out the story. At other times, it seems to happen at random, but of course I wouldn't know for sure because it could just be that there is an illusion of randomness. But it does need to happen at set points to advance the story. So I think it happens it's kind of like a 50-50 thing.
Okay, so but in the terms of good horror, the old adage of don't tell it, show it, and when it comes to horror and gore and violence and things that are supposed to scare you, it goes don't tell it, don't show it, suggest it, because that makes it a lot more a lot more. I don't know what's the palpable. I guess you can sort of identify it with it more because your mind sort of fills in the blanks.
Exactly, and I'm reminded by. I know we're drifting off into horror now, but when I was a child. One of the scariest things I ever saw, and you're going to have a blast with this, probably going to get an eighth stitch, but one of the scariest things I saw was the 1931 adaptation of Dracula starring Bela Lugosi. And that was just because there is no musical score, it's all dead silence apart from dialogue. You don't see blood, you don't see a fucking thing. But your mind just fills in the blanks as to what Dracula's off to when he's off screen, which he is most of the time. And I think a lot of these really powerful moments relating to gore and violence in games kind of share that, suggesting it just makes it stronger.
I think the thing with horror as well, and the way that horror stories are usually constructed, is that one of the reasons that people don't like horror is they go that all horror films are the same, which clearly isn't true. But they do play on a lot of tropes. And one of those tropes is that thing that you suggest and you suggest and you build, and then towards the sort of the final act is where you start to get the really kind of horrific kind of in-your-face things going on. And again, the best horror films are the ones that know that you know the tropes and then twist them slightly.
Yeah. Cabin in the Woods was great.
I couldn't agree more, Gareth. When a horror movie or a horror game, for that matter, sort of circumvents your expectations, and saves either saves the goodies for last, or just have them up front about everything. It's sort of old case. I mean, if you put on a horror movie and it's by some horror director that it's just going to be awful stuff from start to finish, then you've already sort of set yourself into a certain demographic.
Right.
But if you're sitting down and watching like I don't know, like the Babadook. Did any of you guys see that? Or
yes,
It Follows?
Yes, I did.
It Follows was amazing.
I watched Babadook. I haven't watched It Follows. I watched Babadook and I absolutely loved it.
I'm not a big horror fan, but my wife is, so I get dragged to horror films, and I really liked It Follows because it was one of those ones that really did play on the trope. It knew that you kind of knew what should happen if this was going to be a by-the-numbers horror film, but then just slightly took it in a different direction. I thought it was a really good one. Not that this is a film review show, of course.
No, of course not. Because let's drag it back into game territory then.
And again, let's drag it into horrific situations rather than horror, because that's kind of like, you don't necessarily need to have a horror game to have gore and violence in it, and
excellent point.
Yeah, and maybe you should turn the microphone slightly over to Gareth, because we're talking about horror games. You already revealed you're talking about Harvester, and certainly Trilby's Notes is a horror game. Gareth is talking about a game that is a different kind of horror game.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I was most disturbed about the just towards the beginning of Space Quest 1, where you have to fuck Jerry to move the plot on.
I thought that was Space Quest 2. You had to fuck the dead body. But,
you're a sick bastard. Only Mark Crow would do that.
Oh yeah, right. Oh yeah, but like Fred says, you don't actually have to have a horror game to have some really horrific elements, and do carry on. Good doctor.
No. Well, I mean, I'm like Fred. I didn't really play those kind of games certainly when I was a kid, and as I got older, the kind of games that had those more adult or mature themes would be, games set in the Middle Ages or things like Grand Theft Auto. So I had to do a bit of research for this particular show. So I've been spending most of the week looking at YouTube videos and trying to work out how I could kind of think about this kind of stuff. And the game that I thought of was Police Quest 4. So that's the one that I've been looking at. And of course, that's not a horror game, but within the first few minutes, you open a dumpster and see the mutilated body of a child. It's not exactly. That's not exactly PG-13.
Oh, it's just welcome to the game, motherfucker. And I remember that the game got a lot of flack for that, by the way. It's just like, okay, right off the bat, this is not your Jim Wall's happy-go-lucky, I'm the best police guy in the whole world.
No, it's not set in sunny California. And something that they do is they really pull out all the stops in that scene, because when you look into the dumpster and you get the close-up of the dead child, your sound card will shit itself to death. Yes. It's unbelievable. There's just this cacophony of synthesized notes all over the place.
Yeah. And a similar thing happens towards the end when you look in a fridge and see this head just sitting in the fridge. It's a pretty gruesome kind of sight. But what I found really interesting about Police Quest 4 is that actually there's not a huge amount of real gore. I mean, you see dead bodies, but I mean, you see dead bodies in all sorts of settings. I mean, you see dead bodies sometimes in children's films with, people just sort of being, just, and their death is kind of just a thing that happens. But certainly because of the setting that that you're in, as soon as you come across a body that there is a violent story behind how that body got there, some of which you explore in quite a lot of detail. And so I found the game quite interesting from that kind of point of view. What I also found interesting about it as well was the fact that the violence made sense within the universe that had been created by the game. I mean, you're a homicide cop in LA, and there have been a number of murders. So when you see a body that's been mutilated, okay, that's quite horrific in the sort of sense of, it kind of gives you an emotional reaction. But at the same time, that kind of makes sense within the sense of the story that's being told. When you're being shot at, that kind of makes sense because you're in a really rough part of LA and you're a cop. And I'm sure other people get into this. The fact that you're a white cop is probably another reason that you're being shot at. And there's lots of violence and there's lots of things that are pretty gruesome. But at the same time, it's not about the gore or the blood or even the sort of the dead bodies. It's about the sort of the general kind of violence of the world in which this guy works.
Yeah. And it got a lot of flack when it was released because, like I said, the first 3 Police Quest games were not, well, they weren't cartoony as such, but they kind of took a more sort of a kind of a children's book approach to it. With you are the good cop, and you are definitely the goodiest good cop that ever was. And everyone around you, all the villains. I mean, the first Police Quest, the first case you're on is just pulling over a woman driver who's trying to get out of a ticket and such. It's kind of more of a laid back style. And then you've got Police Quest 4 with Daryl F. Racist Gates out of the bat.
No, Trolls. He just pointed out that the arteries of black people are constructed in such a way that they're easier to choke. Compared to and Gareth and I talked a bit about him before we started the show and before you joined. And the thing that was the thing that really fucked people up was that he would say that they were easier to choke compared to, and I quote, normal people.
Hey, God, man. Okay, but anyway, he took the entire Police Quest thing and just set it in L.A., a very real place, and sort of, let's say, I don't know if he exaggerated quite how, the dynamics between white cops and black people in southern L.A. and such, but he certainly didn't pull back from any, let's say, violent situations and stuff that would result in, gory situations. And it got a lot of criticism for that.
Yeah, and I can sort of understand why it got that kind of criticism, but I mean one of the criticisms was as well that the black characters were far too one-dimensional. But every character in that game is one-dimensional because the voice acting is so shit.
It's horrific. It's completely
terrible.
Horrific. But actually, something that is quite interesting with it, I think, is that the cops in Police Quest 4 aren't infallible. I mean, your partner is very cynical, very disillusioned. The mortician is a complete asshole, cracking inappropriate jokes. You've got the one of the first guys that you find murdered, your friend. I think there's a subplot about him being addicted to prescription drugs or something, if I remember correctly. It's a run-down world that the game features.
And I quite like that to an extent. I think it's certainly more honest than that kind of sanitized version of crime investigation that you sometimes get, where you get this kind of idea that you watch an episode of CSI and nobody swears. I mean, really? Do you really think that that's the world that these people inhabit? And I don't know. But it also, and I think one of the things that's very clear about Police Quest as well, what Police Quest 4, this game we're talking about, is that it's very much a product of the early 90s. I mean, it's got this incredibly dark, incredibly violent kind of plot to it, and a very horrible story that's been told. And then every 5 seconds, they'll be saying something, oh, well, that's not the way policemen are supposed to behave. Or you walk into the lobby of the headquarters and it's got the anti-drugs posters all over the place. Kids, say no to drugs. I mean, this was exactly what was going on I'd watch a lot of professional wrestling. And I've been watching quite a bit of pro wrestling from the early 90s. So you'll have these horrific storylines of men beating the shit out of each other. And then The Undertaker will be going, hey, by the way, don't drink and drive. I mean, it's so 90s. It's almost like they don't realise what... I mean, they must have realised what they were doing, surely, but this kind of complete lack of self-awareness. And there are elements of the game that are like that and are a little bit worrying. Like, it is possible to get fired for molesting a fellow police officer. It's possible.
At least you get fired for it.
Well, at least you get fired. But why you click the hand icon on the female officer, and then she gives this spiel about how no, I have my own personal space. I consider what you're doing molestation, and if you do that again, I will report you to my supervisor.
Click.
And it just things like that. You can shoot a 7-year-old girl, and I understand that these kind of things can only be triggered if you're warped enough in your head to try and do these things. But even so, these things are available, and yet at the same time, it also wants to give these kind of very clear expositional messages about personal boundaries, don't do drugs. A police officer is supposed to fill in all of these forms. There's one bit where you can get fired for shooting a person who's trying to stab you.
Because it's not correct procedure. You have to flash him the badge.
You have to show him the paperwork before you...
Well, we joke, but yeah, that seems to be the message that is being shown by this thing. We know... It's been pretty clear over the past couple of years with all the stories coming out of the US and the number of American police that shoot people.
Well, that's all caused by the violent video games, of course.
Caused by violent video games, yeah. But yeah. And that was one of the things that was more disturbing for me. I don't think this game should get any kind of pass for the way that it uses violence. But I also think that a lot of if you just play out the plot how it's supposed to be played out, if it was a movie or if it was like a TV special, I think the way the violence is used is justifiable and fits the way that the game is supposed to be played.
That's actually an interesting point, because I was just thinking, what are we really trying to get out of this episode? And what I want to get out of this episode by bringing up these examples is to sort of find a place where gore and violence is warranted. Not in the sense that we watch. I mean, my wife and I watch a lot of horror movies, and we have made the mistake of watching the Saw movies, for instance, which is just wall to wall gore for no particular reason.
Exactly.
And then of course we've watched good horror movies that have a lot of gore, but it's sort of coincidental because horrible things are happening. They also happen to be good movies, and the same goes for computer games. You can have very, very good games that happen to have a lot of gore and violence in them. That doesn't make them bad games, because there are people out there, again, mostly in America, but also for some reason on the Australian censor board, who seem to think that every time you show someone getting, lightly slapped in the face, that's a horrific act and should never be portrayed in any form of entertainment media, because God knows who might go out and try that for themselves.
I think the British have that thing as well. I can't think of any examples with games, but I know for a fact that Attack of the Clones, Star Wars Episode 2, was in fact censored in the UK because it cuts out a brief headbutt between Obi-Wan Kenobi and Jango Fett.
Well, I'll defend our the British Film Board of Classification, or the British Film Classification Board,
The
whoever they
Nazis.
are, the Nazis, on this one. They spend a lot of time working out. I mean, it must be a really weird job working out sort of which words are offensive and which acts are offensive. They didn't tell Star Wars that they couldn't do that. What they did was they said, if you include that scene in the way it's shot, you'll have to make this a 15. So it was not so much that they censored it, but more that they told them that, well, if you want this to be I think it would have been a 12 or a 12A. At the time, if you want this to be this movie that you can market to children,
if you want it to be the kiddie movie, it actually is.
Yeah. I would also say that actually one of the things that you brought up America, Britain, and Australia, the sort of the Anglo-Saxon world. We seem to accept quite a lot of blood and gore and violence. The thing that we can't ever possibly accept is an erect penis or a tit. That seems to be what we like to censor a lot more than violence.
And that has always really puzzled me, because we have reached a point where American TV shows on network television, where they do have to censor quite a lot of bits. I was going to say, but yeah, language and violence and sex, of course. But we've gotten to the point where you can show a clearly mutilated corpse in a series like Hannibal. There's an infamous scene where some guy has strung up two people and ripped the flesh from their backs, hanging them from hooks down the ceiling so they look like angels with their wings splayed. That sort of thing is fine, but every time you strip a woman down to even her underwear, all of a sudden this has to go on very, very late at night.
You do have to make a distinction between, HBO are featuring a lot of shows where there's a lot of nudity and certainly violence, of course, too. But I'm watching Banshee, and there's a lot of fucks being said and a lot of tits being shown.
Yes, but that's the difference there is that's not network television. That's not what's being piped into people's homes without having to pay for it.
That's kind of interesting about games, because it's kind of comparable to how indie games have risen, and now you can have a game like Hotline Miami, which would never have worked had Sierra really. I know it's not an adventure game, but had a company like Sierra released that, it would have tanked. These guys were making family-friendly entertainment, but now you can be an indie developer, having your own style. That one.
Yeah, but I guess what I really want to go for here, with the two examples that you have brought up, and I want to sort of tie this thing together somehow, is that, and I don't know if this is just me trying to defend my own immature sensibilities, but
probably.
But this whole idea that if there is gore and tits and swear words and all of this stuff in an adventure game or a movie or a book or whatever, it is somehow puerile and should be beneath us in some distinguished form of distinguished manner. And I would respectfully disagree, actually quite unrespectfully disagree, because I think in some cases it is quite it is warranted. You have to show what is actually going on, and there are examples of media of all sorts where sickening things will make people's heads turn away, but that's because these things actually happen in real life, and we're just so used to this, like Gareth said, the sanitized version that the media used to portray in the 90s and 80s, and certainly as far back as the 50s, where no one would even leave the house without putting on a suit and tie. So this idea of actually showing that awful stuff can happen is not, first of all, it's not conducive to people going out and making more awful stuff happen. And second of all, it's not something that you should sanitize away just because you want to appeal to a slightly more sophisticated demographic.
I do agree, but you should also consider what Gareth said about Police Quest 4 and consider, is it actually necessary that I show this? Because I agree with you completely. I don't think we should sanitize anything, certainly for the sake of sanitizing it, but you need to know where to draw the line. I mean, there is a point certainly where it's gratuitous and where it'll just hurt the story you're trying to tell.
Yeah, we will get to the gratuitous bit in just a second with my example, but I do want to posit the question to both of you gentlemen. The gore and violence in the examples that you have brought up, were they warranted? Did they enrich in the experience? Were they important to the gaming experience? Fred?
Yeah. I would say it was. The realm that you're transported into. There's a lot of gore in the game apart from that, actually. There are people being shot, a child being beaten to death in a flashback. And I think it serves to make the story more horrific, yeah. And the thing to remember is it was also the third game in an ongoing series. And it was the first game to... You had this serial killer, undead serial killer named John Defoe, this guy wearing an apron and a welder's mask and wielding a machete. And to begin with, he was just this Michael Myers stereotype. You knew nothing about him. He was just there. And Trilby's notes explored some of the trauma that led to his creation as this mass-murdering monster. And indeed, it explored some of the evil spirits that leapt into the body of this kid who was, maligned and beaten to death by his dad. And it all kind of enriches that world to get these shock moments.
But okay, so let me flip the question around before I get to you, good doctor. Would the game have been just as effective, or could you have told the story without the in-your-face gore?
I don't think you would have been able to do that without going for too many other cliches to cover those emotional shocks. Certainly you could have the picture cutting out at just the right moment, or you could have a musical sting or whatever, sound effects off screen, but there is a point where something like that just becomes a cliche as well. So, I would definitely go with the on-screen violence for a game like that.
Oh yeah, and being transported to this other world with blood dripping down the walls and stuff. You can't just suggest that.
No, you can't sanitize that. That was like an inherent quality of this dream world or nightmare realm.
Okay, so let's turn the mic over to the good doctor. Would you say that the amount of violence and gore devalued the serious quote-unquote story that the game wanted to tell?
No, I think once you've made the story that you want to tell, once you've made the decision, that you want to tell a story about a serial killer that's killed 5 people, including a child, I think if you hadn't put that violence in there, you'd have been chickening out. I mean, there's a question to be asked about whether that game needed to be made at that time.
Daryl F.
Raises Gates thought,
and those kind of questions always exist. In the same way, it's often very justifiable that the main character is a white guy. But maybe it would be nice that there were some stories that actually had some kind of, ethnic or gender representation. But no, once you've made that decision, you're telling the story about a violent serial killer, and you've set the story up in that way. The violence made sense within the story that was being told, and never was a replacement for the plot.
Okay, so it was never in. You wouldn't say that. Sorry, my mind is wandering. You wouldn't say that the violence and gore in Police Quest 4 was gratuitous or just there for the shock value. It actually served a point to the story.
No, I think it served a point to the story, and even the examples that I've given of the ability to be able to shoot a child in the face or shoot a dog.
Well, who hasn't wanted to at some point?
Well, one, who hasn't wanted to at some point, and two, those are reliant upon you deliberately making the wrong decision and continuing to do it to make the game do it, and therefore that's not really. It's honest of the game's designers that they knew that some people would try and do that, and therefore it factored that scenario into the universe. But for the most part, I think it pretty much holds up.
And it allows Daryl F. Gates to be really smug about it because he's voicing the narrator in it, and he's such an asshole. Whenever you do something wrong, you can just hear this exasperated sigh. Detective, I'd prefer if you didn't try to do that. And fuck off, I'm playing the game.
Oh, that's actually last question before I get into my little thing. Because we're talking about agency. We had this discussion in the extras bit when we were talking about walking simulators, and now we're getting into it again because the agency of the player is to try and perform those actions that would be frowned upon in the extreme if they went out and did it in real life. And this, I think, is why games like my favorite, Carmageddon, or games like Grand Theft Auto, it's games that quote-unquote promote social miscreancy or whatever. These are actually outlets for, because you wouldn't run around outside during, or run around during a school shooting and going, that was awesome. But the idea of running someone over and beating them to death and shooting them in the face and such within a computer game, you have people sitting down going, oh, that was awesome, I hit him in the head from a great distance or whatever. It allows people to not act out, fantasies that they might have of killing people, but it allows them to engage in socially unacceptable behavior without the consequences of the police knocking on your door and reading your Miranda rights.
But is this true of adventure games?
And that's what I was going to get to, because with the amount of agency that you have in Police Quest 4, you of course have the agency to do the right thing and continue the story, but you also have the agency to shoot a kid in the face and fondle a colleague's boobs until she gets so pissed at you she has you fired.
Until she gets so pissed at you, as if having won.
It was fun once. Now back away from me.
But it does. I would certainly sit down and at some point maybe I would grow bored with the story. Maybe I would just like to see if the designers actually put in a response for doing this completely heinous thing that you would never do in real life. And there's something humanely, there's something in the human spirit about seeking out wrong things. Like when you're a baby and you try and stick your fingers in a light socket. I mean, babies know that this is where electricity comes out of. And as a kid, once you've stuck your fingers in the electrical socket and gotten a little jolt, the first thing you're going to do is go over to your brother and say, "Hey, stick your fingers in the light sockets. It's awesome."
And then you're going to try your dick. Well, I was the only one who did that.
I think you were.
How did you manage to get your dick into a light? No.
It was very, very.
I'll tell you in the After Dark special.
But that's a good point, I think, Trolls, because a lot of the violence in Police Quest, at least as far as the plot is concerned, is stuff that happens in the universe that you inhabit. It's not something that you initiate or that happens to you, apart from perhaps the final act, which I won't spoil because some people might still, after this, want to play it. For the most part, this is stuff that happens. That you're inhabiting a violent world rather than being the violent element within that world, if that makes any sense.
That makes perfect sense. Okay, so at this point, I think I'm going to bring up my example, finally, because we are, after all, coming up on the, the 40-minute mark? Did we start this 40 minutes ago?
Yeah, we're about 40 minutes in.
Yeah, so I'm gonna do this real quick, but the reason why I wanted to go last was because the game Harvester, that I'm going to be talking about very briefly, is actually trying to make a point about the whole thing about gore and violence in games by being over-the-top gory and violent and having you commit horrific immoral acts because you want to get through the story. It starts out very innocently. For those of you who haven't played Harvester, go look it up. It's really, really campy, and the gore and violence in the FMVs is just atrociously produced and such. But it starts off very innocently. There's an order in town. You wake up in this 1950s sort of suburbia thing, and you, of course, have amnesia, because who doesn't love that trope? And there's this monk order or something called the Order of the Harvest Moon, and everyone in this town is telling you should join the order. Everything is so much fun in there. And of course, the game doesn't go anywhere unless you complete these tasks for the order. Excuse me. So these order monks have you perform certain tasks in order to be considered to enter this sacred society that they have going. And it starts off innocently by keying someone's car, but you do end up you end up burning down a diner and having the proprietor of the diner and her 5-year-old daughter commit murder suicide. stuff really just gets awful. And once you actually get into the lodge where this order resides, it just turns into an utterly batshit, surreal nightmare world where you descend into levels where eyeballs are poking out of the walls, and you engage in really, really awful combat with murder clowns and monsters, and a keymaster who will gleefully stab himself in the face with an axe, and then you have to pick a little golden key out of the shattered remains of his skull, and the whole game just goes absolutely batshit insane. The whole point of it, at least as far as I could see, was to actually make this point about how even if a game rewards you for committing very antisocial acts and portraying really violent, gory things on screen, this does not make you a miscreant in the real world. And I am going to spoil the ending here because that is of utmost importance. And trust me, this is my last sentence on the subject. In the end, you find out that you've been inhabiting this virtual world situation where you're actually being groomed to be a secret serial killer for this secret organization. And they just sort of, captured you and stuffed you into this virtual simulation and had you commit all these violent acts just to sort of groom you into becoming a serial killer for in the real world. And you have a choice whether you want to remain in the virtual world because you don't want to be a serial killer, or you've decided, yeah, I'm pretty good at this shit, let me out, and I'll start killing people for you. And surreptitiously, the game sort of asks the player the same question. And pretty much everyone I've seen play the game elect, at least for their first playthrough, they elect to stay in the virtual world because that means you'll be safe and you'll be together with your love interest in the game, although she contributes absolutely squat to the story. And such, and then only after they've seen the quote-unquote good ending, they go back and they check up on, okay, what would have happened if I actually were a complete and total nutcase. So I find a game like Harvester, with all its campiness and its shitty production quality and the over-the-top gore and violence and such, it actually has a really strong point about gore and violence in interactive mediums. The sad thing is that this game took forever to produce, and it looks utterly shit, even by the standards of when it was released.
Yeah, I looked at it in preparation for this episode, and I can only agree. The problem with making such a point is that you need to, you better just do it damn well, because if you have a game that looks like Harvester and looks like it was produced in someone's garage, then the whole thing just falls apart, and the point becomes... It utterly falls apart. I remember Mel Brooks saying when he was doing Spaceballs, which is one of my favorite comedy movies, he said that if you're going to parody something, you have to do it at least as good as the stuff that you're parodying, which is why he went to great lengths to build these superb model ships. I mean, Spaceballs, even if you think it's a stupid movie, you can't argue that it doesn't look fantastic, because the dude got the guys at ILM who did the special effects for Star Wars to do the special effects for his parody movie. Well, the beginning is fantastic, certainly. I mean, you've got a great parody of the opening shot of the original Star Wars, only here the ship goes on forever and ever and ever and ever.
And the same thing could be said for Harvester, because if they wanted to make their point effective, they had a good point in my what's the word I'm looking for?
Opinion.
My opinion, that's the one.
We've hit a new low here.
I think I hit my head a bit harder than I initially anticipated. But if they had gone out of the way to make it look really, really good. I mean, really make people's head turn away instead of just going, that looks so fake. And I can't help but wonder, actually, if it was intentional that the game looks as shit as it does, because it just looks like some Sunday school, after school, people playing with camcorders and stuff, blue screen.
Well, many
nightmare.
games in the 90s looked like that, so I'm going to be a buzzkill and say probably not. It probably just looked like that because the 90s happened.
Okay.
Well, I'm sure we'll have a discussion later on in the series about how technology ruined certain games.
We are, certainly.
Oh, yes. So anyway, that was my spiel about Harvester, and I think if we're going to take anything away from this discussion, and I'm going to go around the table but I want to start. If I'm going to take something away from this discussion, it's my, I suppose, already stated point that you can have a good story and show gore and violence and such when it's warranted by the story. And you can also, on the flip side, I think it's perfectly acceptable to have a game where it is gratuitously thrown in your face, because there also is there's a demographic for gore hounds who watch movies like Brain Dead by Peter Jackson and stuff. You shouldn't let's say. Again, what's the word I'm looking for? Devalue. You shouldn't look down upon people who enjoy a good gore movie, because they might be very, very balanced and sensitive and intelligent people. They just happen to like a certain style of movie. And people who watch gore movies, I've found. I have friends who watch much more horrid shit than I do. They don't watch it because they're social miscreants and they want horrible things to happen to people. It's because that they know that these movies are shit in a sort of this is not highbrow quality entertainment or anything. They do realize that. It's not that you sit down and watch Brain Dead and think it's like Citizen Kane or shit. But it's. And the same thing should go for computer games. I'm not going to apologize to anyone for enjoying ripping spines out in Mortal Kombat or running over senior citizens in Carmageddon. That's not because I'm a social miscreant. It's just because first of all, they're great games, and second of all, the gore and violence is so over the top and gratuitous that it becomes humorous. Look at a movie like RoboCop. People often mistake that movie for being a serious sci-fi with an awful lot of gore, and they even had to censor out a lot of gore for the theatrical release because Americans are pussies. But if you watch the unedited director's cut of RoboCop, there's so much violence that it becomes humorous, which was the intention.
It's kind of like a satire, isn't it?
It is.
The second RoboCop, of course, completely tops it in that everyone's just batshit insane in that one, and it was made by a batshit insane individual, Frank Miller, so it makes sense.
No, that was the third one. Wait, he did the story. Never mind, that's not important.
It was the second one.
Yeah, the point is, for some people, black comedy and RoboCop is a comedy film, and you could look at Harvester as a sort of black comedy because it does. It does go so gruesomely over the top that it becomes funny, and the same goes for Grand Theft Auto and Mortal Kombat. No one's saying that this is going to advance the human race in some profound way, but it is damn entertaining, and I don't think we should apologize for that. Okay, I'm done. Let's go around the table to first of all the Good Doctor. Do you have any closing remarks on the subject?
Yeah, I think what you've said is a really good point that you can.
However, rambling.
Well, no, but you can get away with doing those kind of things if there's some kind of quality and consistency in everything else that's happening. You can have slightly sexist jokes if it's very clear that everybody is in on the joke, including the women themselves, and actually they have some agency in the end that ends up, screwing over everybody else anyway, and that those jokes end up undermining themselves. So that kind of works in something like Space Quest 4 with the latex babes, and doesn't work in the entire of Rex Nebula. And I think
Exactly.
the same is very much true of violence as well. If you're just putting the violence in because, quite frankly, you've got nothing else, then it looks gratuitous, it feels gratuitous, and it just makes you feel a bit icky. But if you're putting it in because it's really advancing a plot in a serious way, or, like you said, you're using it as a kind of nobody believes that this is real, it's a cartoon, that's very different to just... The word that's often used is pornographic. And it is very possible to have a very detailed sex scene in a film and use that to tell a very important story. And yes, part of it may be for titillation, part of it may be to draw an emotional reaction out of you. But if that emotional reaction helps to further the story that you want to tell, I don't really have too much of a problem with that. Where I have a problem is where people are clearly using it because they've run out of ideas and because it's a quick buck.
Yeah. Or if you're just telling a story about a plumber or a pizza delivery guy or a pool man.
A lot of those films are underrated, Fred.
They do actually advance the human condition in a meaningful way, I would say. Oh shit, what was I going to ask? Because we are the backseat designers. We haven't really talked much about gore and violence in a sort of design capacity, because frankly, this is more of a overhead type of discussion. We will be getting into the nitty gritty details of good game design in the future episodes. But if you were to point out an incident in, for instance, in Police Quest 4. Where you as the player are directed by the game to commit a horrible act or a violent act that is either warranted or non-warranted. Is there some sort of specific thing that you would highlight?
Well, yeah, I mean, the very final scene, you kind of, in order to save a potential victim and your own life, you have to kill the serial killer. Won't say how or in what circumstances, but I mean that then has to happen. And I think that is a really, if the point that you're getting at is that there's a difference between having violence in a game and you as the player having to initiate that violence and being the architect of that violence, even if you're forced into that corner, it does become a very different thing. You're not the one mutilating the children. And that's it's very different to find a mutilated child in a dumpster and to put a mutilated child in a dumpster. At least that's what I've heard from various court cases.
Yeah, unless you're Jimmy Savile.
In which case it's the same thing.
Okay. And I think that brings up a very good point that we can get into later, is that switching you were playing as the good cop and then all of a sudden having the game practically hold your hand and squeeze the trigger for you. That's kind of an interesting switch. We could probably go into that sometime later. But right now, I'm going to turn the mic over to Fred.
Well,
what's your take of all this?
Yeah, you guys already fired off some pretty good shots, and I must say I'm in agreement. What I would like to say is that this has been kind of a... well, they all are, but this has been kind of a rambling episode because we focused so heavily on horror games all of a sudden, which is a topic we've done before. So something that I'm taking away from all of this, apart from the stuff that has already been said, is that I would urge designers to try, and this is going to sound wrong, but experience with gore and violence in other settings than in a traditional horror setting. Police Quest 4 was a great example, but I myself was pressed trying to come up with a game that had gore and violence in it, but was not necessarily a horror game. I mean,
Space Quest.
Well, yeah, but
Space Quest gets gruesome, man.
It does at times, but that's mostly stuff it's mostly stuff that's happening to you. Whereas in Police Quest 4, while we've talked about what the protagonist John Carey can and can't do of horrific acts, it's just as much stuff that you observe. But
Space Quest does play a gore and violence for comedy effect. I mean, just the metal sheet at the start of Space Quest 3 when you cut an artery and it just dances around in a pool of his own blood.
But again, that's player death, and they're all pretty gruesome as far as Sierra games go. So if that's the baseline, then every single Sierra game becomes about gore and violence. I do realize the two guys from Andromeda had fun with it, but I mean, if death is the baseline, then it's just as gruesome in theory to have King Graham being eaten by crocodiles that are mysteriously in the Daventry moat.
Okay, so let's make a distinct difference between those things. I mean, King Graham, you don't actually see blood spurting out of his head as it's being decapitated. I mean, the two guys from Andromeda went above and beyond trying to make the deaths gruesome because that made them funny.
They did, but
in King's Quest, you sort of feel bad for King Graham, at least if you happen to like the guy, which I don't.
Yeah, I don't either. But I mean, the two guys were doing it for laughs. First and foremost, they weren't doing it they were trying to get an emotional response based in humor out of you, whereas something like Police Quest 4 certainly isn't. It's trying to shock you, it's trying to make you feel disgusted and most importantly, understand the plight of a homicide officer in LA.
Yeah, and then you have to fill out form disgust 137 just to the fact that you got disgusted.
I felt disgusted and I was extremely offended.
3 points.
Okay, so I think we've sort of rounded out what we can do in the episode here, but as you may have noticed, we do tend to go on for quite a bit, and when we do so, we put our After Dark specials up on our YouTube page and also on our Patreon page. So if tonight's topic has interested you even slightly, then you can. We'll probably continue this discussion for a bit after hanging up here. So you can go and check that out. Sorry, I'm rambling a bit. I got hit in the head something fierce last night. Gore and violence, people. Gore and violence. I'm going to go into the intro spiel now.
Outro spiel.
Outro spiel. I got hit in the head very hard, apparently. Thank you guys for listening to this episode of Backseat Designers. You can, of course, interact with us. We would love to hear from you. So please do send Fred an email or even record your voice and send him the MP3 file. And we will make sure to play it on the show if you have something to contribute to. I'm sorry, I just got a message on the chat here that says we've lost the great Dr. Milwood.
I was trying to do that behind the scenes to not interrupt you, but you basically interrupted yourself. That was very nice.
So, in honor of the great late Dr. Gareth Milwood, I would
Speaking of gore and violence, we killed Gareth.
We would like to invite you to pay his respects over on our website, backseatdesigners.com, where you can subscribe to the show and also to our other not game show, Open Crowdsource. You can find us on Twitter at BSDesigners. You can find us on Facebook and our Facebook group.com/groups/backseatdesigners. And, of course, you can find all of that shit on YouTube at youtube.com/backseatdesigners. And you can also contribute to our Gore and Violence Patreon fund over on patreon.com/backseatdesigners. Sensing a pattern here? I think we all are. So, that's going to be it for us. I think say goodbye, Fred.
Goodbye.
And say goodbye for Gareth, Fred.
I think he's here.
I've finally managed to get back. I had no idea what was going on. Goodbye.
Okay, goodbye,
that was perfect timing. Goodbye.
Yeah. See you guys next week.
No more for today.